In the summer of 1897, a 29-year-old chemist named Felix Hoffmann sat in a laboratory at the Bayer Company in Elberfeld, Germany, adding an acetyl group to every molecule he could find. His father was suffering from rheumatic pain and could no longer swallow the standard treatment, salicylic acid, without vomiting. Hoffmann was desperate. On August 10th, he acetylated salicylic acid and produced a pure, stable form of acetyl salicylic acid. He had just created aspirin. 11 days later, he acetylated morphine and produced diacetylmorphine. Bayer trademarked it as heroin and marketed it to adults and children as a non-addictive cough suppressant from 1898 to 1910. Two drugs 11 days apart from the same pair of hands. One became the most widely used medicine in human history. The other became the most devastating illegal substance on Earth. Bayer knew heroin was addictive early on. They marketed it anyway for over a decade. And it gets worse. In 1925, Bayer merged with 5 other companies to form IG Farben, the largest chemical conglomerate in the world. IG Farben became the financial backbone of the Nazi regime. They used slave labour from concentration camps. They produced Zyklon B, the gas used in the Holocaust. After the war, the Allies seized and dismantled IG Farben. Bayer was re-established as an independent company in 1951. In 1994, they bought back the American rights to their most famous product for $1 billion. Today, the global over-the-counter painkiller market is worth $30 billion. Bayer. AG remains one of its dominant players, and the tree whose bark started the whole story 3,500 years before Felix Hoffmann was born, still grows along every river, every wetland, every ditch in the temperate world. You can walk up to it right now and chew a piece of bark the same way human beings have been doing since the Sumerians carved it onto clay tablets 4 millennia ago. But I need to be honest with you about something that most channels covering this story leave out. It is not as simple as chewing bark instead of swallowing a pill. The real story is more complicated, more interesting, and more important than the myth. This is the story of willow bark. The first recorded use of willow as medicine dates to the Sumerians, roughly 4,000 years ago, documented on clay tablets describing the bark as a treatment for pain. The ancient Egyptians included willow in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts describing its ability to draw heat from inflamed wounds. Chinese physicians used willow bark and poplar bark for centuries to treat rheumatic fever, colds, hemorrhages, and goiter. The Greek physician Hippocrates, writing around 400 BC, recommended chewing willow bark to patients suffering from fever and pain. He prescribed a brew of willow leaves to ease the pain of childbirth. A century later, Dioscorides documented willow as an anti-inflammatory in De Materia Medica. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, recommended poplar bark for sciatica and willow leaves boiled in vinegar for gout. For millennia, across continents and civilizations that never communicated with each other, human beings independently discovered that this tree reduced pain. That is not coincidence. That is chemistry waiting to be named. The naming began in 1763, when an English clergyman named Reverend Edward Stone did something remarkably strange. He chewed on a piece of white willow bark purely out of curiosity and was struck by how bitter it tasted. The bitterness reminded him of cinchona bark, the Peruvian treatment for malaria. Stone wondered if willow might treat fevers the same way. He dried the bark, ground it into powder, and began dosing patients suffering from ague. It worked. He wrote a letter to the Royal Society describing his results, and that letter became the first clinical documentation of willow bark's antipyretic effects in modern medical history. Over a century later, in 1876, a Scottish physician named Thomas McLagan took the investigation further. He was suffering from acute rheumatism himself. He dosed himself with salicin, the active compound that had by then been isolated from willow bark, before administering it to a patient. Both recovered completely. The fever dropped, the joint inflammation disappeared. McLagan published his results, and the demand for willow bark surged. Chemistry had been advancing in parallel, driven partly by war. At the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon's continental blockade cut off supplies of Peruvian cinchona bark, the standard treatment for malaria. European scientists scrambled to find domestic alternatives. Willow bark, already known for its fever-reducing properties, became the focus of intense chemical investigation. In 1828, Johann Buchner at the University of Munich isolated a bitter yellow substance from willow bark and named it salicin, after salix, the Latin word for willow. Henri Leroux, a French pharmacist, purified it into crystalline form the following year. Raphael Perea later refined it into salicylic acid. By the late 1800s, the Hayden Chemical Company in Germany was mass-producing synthetic salicylic acid for pain and fever. But salicylic acid was brutal on the stomach. It was bitter, it caused nausea, and it irritated the gastrointestinal lining so severely that many patients could not tolerate it. This is where Hofmann enters. His father's inability to keep salicylic acid down drove Felix Hofmann to search Bayer's laboratory archives. He found that a French chemist named Charles Gerhardt had produced an impure version of acetyl salicylic acid back in 1853 but had abandoned the research. Hofmann refined the process and produced a pure, stable form. Heinrich Dreser, head of Bayer's pharmaceutical lab, tested it on himself first, then on animals, then on patients at a hospital in Allerlande Saale, in one of the first pharmaceutical trials involving human subjects. Bayer named the compound aspirin, the A from acetyl, the spe from spirea, the genus of meadowsweet plants that were an alternative source of salicylic acid. They began distributing it as a powder in 1899. The first water-soluble aspirin tablets, introduced a year later, became the first medicine ever sold in tablet form. But there is a footnote to this story that Bayer would prefer you not examine. In 1949, a chemist named Arthur Eichengrun published a paper claiming that he, not Hofmann, had planned and directed the synthesis of aspirin. He said Hofmann's role was limited to bench-level laboratory work following Eichengrun's instructions. Eichengrun was Jewish. During the Nazi era, he had been deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. He survived 14 months of internment. He published his claim in the journal Pharmazie and died the same month. In 1999, historian Walter Sneeder at the University of Strathclyde re-examined the evidence and concluded that Eichengrun's account was convincing. Bayer disputed the findings. The official credit remains with Hofmann. The man who may have actually invented aspirin was erased from the story by the same political movement that his employer helped finance. Now here is the part where I need to be straight with you, because the internet has turned willow bark into a fairy tale, and I am not going to do that. Aspirin is not willow bark in a pill. Aspirin is a synthetic modification of a compound inspired by willow bark. Your body converts both salicin from willow bark and acetyl salicylic acid from aspirin into the same active molecule, salicylic acid, which blocks the cyclooxygenase enzyme and inhibits prostaglandin production, reducing pain, fever, and inflammation. But the concentrations are not remotely comparable. The salicin content in willow bark varies wildly from 0.04% to over 12% depending on the species, the season, and the age of the tree. A clinically effective dose of 240 mg of salicin, the amount recommended by the European Scientific Cooperative on Phytotherapy, would be extremely difficult to obtain by simply chewing raw white willow bark. One study found that 240 mg of salicin produced blood levels of salicylic acid equivalent to roughly 87 mg of aspirin. A single standard aspirin tablet contains 300 to 500 mg. Aspirin was genuinely an improvement. It delivered a consistent dose. It was easier to manufacture, store, and distribute. It reduced the stomach irritation that made raw salicylic acid intolerable for many patients. Bayer did not invent a lie. They refined a real medicine into a more reliable form. That is the honest truth. But here is the other honest truth. In refining that medicine, Bayer erased the original entirely. They did not say here is a better version of something nature provides for free. They said here is our product, buy it every month, and forget that trees exist. The willow tree, which had served human medicine for 3,500 years across every major civilization on the planet, disappeared from the conversation within a single generation. And the company that erased it went on to trademark heroin, merge into a conglomerate that financed the Nazi war machine, produce the gas used in the Holocaust, rebuild itself after the war, and buy back its most famous brand for $1 billion. Today, 40,000 metric tons of aspirin are consumed every year. The global over-the-counter painkiller market generates over $30 billion annually. Bayer launched a new fast-acting aspirin formulation called Aspirin Ultra in June 2024. They are still innovating on a molecule they extracted from a tree 127 years ago. The tree still grows in the same riverbanks and wetlands where Reverend Stone chewed that first piece of bark out of curiosity in 1763. Nobody sends you a bill for chewing bark, but willow bark is not a simple replacement, and telling you otherwise would be dishonest. Modern standardized willow bark extracts, the kind you can buy as supplements, do have clinical support. A meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials found that willow bark extract provided meaningful pain relief for arthritis patients. A randomised double-blind study showed that a standardised extract containing 240 mg of salicin reduced low back pain significantly compared to placebo. The European Scientific Cooperative on Phytotherapy recommends willow bark extract for pain and fever. Germany's Commission E has approved it. Willow bark also contains flavonoids and polyphenols that contribute to anti-inflammatory effects through mechanisms that aspirin alone does not share. It is a more complex medicine than a single synthetic molecule, but it is also less predictable, harder to dose, and slower acting than a factory-produced tablet. If you are having a heart attack, you need aspirin, not bark. If you're managing chronic joint pain, a standardized willow bark extract might be worth exploring with your doctor. The science supports both medicines. The difference is that one of them costs nothing, grows everywhere, and has been quietly removed from the conversation by a company with 127 years of marketing behind it. If you've been following this channel, you know we will tell you when the evidence is overwhelming and when it is complicated. Willow bark is complicated. It works, but it works differently than aspirin, at different doses, through partially different mechanisms and with different limitations. That complexity is exactly why a pharmaceutical company could step in, simplify the molecule, standardize the dose, and sell you a version that made the original disappear. The simplification is the business model. Here is what you can do with this tree. White willow, Salix alba, grows along streams, rivers, ponds, and wet lowlands across the temperate world. It is one of the most recognizable trees in any landscape, with long, narrow, silvery green leaves and flexible branches that sweep toward the water. The bark is harvested from young branches, 2 to 3 years old, in early spring when the sap is rising and the bark peels easily. Use a sharp knife to score the bark lengthwise, then peel it in strips. Dry the strips in a warm, well-ventilated place out of direct sunlight until they are brittle. To brew willow bark tea, simmer 1 to 2 teaspoons of dried bark in a cup of water for 10 to 15 minutes, strain, and drink up to 3 times daily. The taste is bitter. Some people add honey or mix it with other herbs. This is the same preparation that Reverend Stone administered to his fever patients in 1763, that Thomas McLagan used to cure his own rheumatism in 1876, and that countless generations before them brewed from bark they stripped from the same species of tree. If you prefer consistency, standardized willow bark extract supplements are available and should contain a specified amount of salicin per dose. Do not combine willow bark with aspirin, blood thinners, or other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, as the compounds work through the same pathways and can amplify side effects. Do not give willow bark to children due to the risk of Reyes syndrome, the same warning that applies to aspirin. If you are pregnant, nursing, or have gastrointestinal conditions, consult your healthcare provider first. Now picture this. It is 10 years from now. There is a willow tree at the edge of your property, its branches dipping toward the water the way willows have done for millions of years. Every spring you strip a few lengths of bark from the young branches and dry them in the same room where your family stores herbs, seeds, and dried roots from a dozen other episodes of this channel. You brew a cup when your joints ache after a long day. It is bitter. It is slow. It does not come in a blister pack. But it connects you to something that no corporation can manufacture. A chain stretching 3,500 years of human beings reaching for the same tree when they were in pain. Reverend Edward Stone, Thomas McLagan, Hippocrates, the unnamed Sumerian who carved the first record onto clay, and a 29-year-old chemist named Hoffman, who took what that tree offered and turned it into the most profitable pill on earth, 11 days before he created heroin in the same laboratory for the same company. The tree does not judge, it just grows. It has outlasted every empire that tried to own what it gives away for free. And if you want to go deeper into the remedies we've been uncovering, head to our website where you can grab our free ebook on lost plant remedies you can start using today. Thanks for watching, check out another video, and make sure to hit subscribe.